It's easy to think of the past as a time of good manners, religious fanatics, and male power struggles, but that wasn't always the case. There is evidence that both the ruling class and regular people in Rome, Greece, and Egypt took part in and publicly enjoyed all kinds of wild intercourse. When it comes to Victorian England, the idea that it was strict and prudish has never been more true. In the 1800s, people tried to avoid getting close to each other at all costs, so they came up with strange and creative ways to avoid doing the horizontal mambo. So what kinds of steps did people take to stay safe during this time? Chastity devices, religious beliefs, and shame were all very effective ways to stop people from making love outside of reproduction. Don't get it wrong, this was a time of control, and they did everything they could to keep people from getting together. There was a mascot for repression. Since it seemed like everyone in Victorian England was repressed in some way, it makes sense that repression finally took the form of Mrs. Grundy, who was originally an off-stage character in Thomas Morton's 1798 play Speed the Plough. In that play, people worried about what Mrs. Grundy, who was very traditional and conservative, would think of what they did. Over time, the name of the figure became a shorthand way to say respectable restraint or extreme purity. During the Victorian era, people used Mrs. Grundy to keep their wants in check. There were male chastity devices. People of the Victorian age were all about being in charge of yourself. Even though this way of thinking hurt women the most, it also hurt men. People thought that if men weren't so focused on their sexual needs, they would have more time to work on being useful parts of society. From this idea came the first anti-masturbation gadgets. The jugum penis is a piece of clothing that was made to stop men from accidentally or on purpose self-pleasuring themselves. When worn at night, the ring's teeth would dig into any sudden erections. This would wake the user up and make him want to get himself together instead of finishing any nocturnal emissions. Women were encouraged to find a bathroom if their partners got too frisky. For women, having sexual relations was a necessary part of having children. If they saw it as more than that, it would put them in a lower class. That meant they had to keep an eye on their men in case they started to act horny. Sometimes, that meant doing things that seemed crazy. Ruth Smithers wrote a book called Sex Tips for Husbands and Wives. In it, she gave a very important tip. If he attempts to kiss her on the lips, she should turn her head slightly so that the kiss falls harmlessly on her cheek instead. If he lifts her gown and attempts to kiss her any place else, she should quickly pull the gown back in place, spring from the bed, and announce that nature calls her to the toilet. Things became more open and acceptable in the 1890s. Society can only be very proper for so long before the rules become too strict and cause problems. Even though they were never talked about openly, prostitution and pornography have always been a part of Victorian society. By the end of the 19th century, Victorian society had a thriving, hidden sexual culture. Some believed touching yourself could drive men and women insane. During the Victorian era, many people thought that self-pleasure made them sick and hurt their bodies. Scientists all agreed that masturbation was a common reason why people went crazy. Later, many different diseases and conditions were linked to the bad effects of masturbating. Also, people who were pale, overweight, or too skinny were thought to be likely to masturbate often. It was improper to do it more than 2 times a week. Ruth Smithers wrote a book about relationships that came out in 1894. She says that couples shouldn't sleep together more than twice a week. The wise bride will permit a maximum of 2 brief sexual experiences weekly, and as time goes by, she should make every effort to reduce this frequency. Feigned illness, sleepiness, and headaches are among her best friends in this matter. Having children out of wedlock was stigmatized. Even though illegitimate births didn't happen very often in the Victorian age, when they did, it was a big taboo. Fictional figures like Hetty Sorrel and Fanny Robin added to the idea that women who became pregnant without being married were sad and broken. Single moms often left their newborns at the front of hospitals because they were afraid of becoming outcasts. In the worst cases, women who were desperate killed their infant children. Prostitution freaked people out. In the past, prostitution was a job like any other, but during the Victorian era, it went against the social norms that were popular at the time. It wasn't just because of sexual activity. Prostitutes also stood for freedom for women from the patriarchy. Since prostitutes weren't part of a family, they had more social and financial freedom than other women. So, popular culture called prostitutes fallen women to make them feel bad and try to stop young women from following in their footsteps. If you didn't want to get hot, you stayed away from mustard. Since it was frowned upon to do it for fun, and because Swiss neurologist Samuel Auguste Tissot's study showed a link between self-pleasure and madness, Victorian men were stuck between a rock and a hard place when they felt aroused. Men were told to avoid foods like mustard, pepper, rich gravy, beer, wine, cider, and cigarettes, which were thought to make people feel sexually aroused in order to stop feeling horny. Women were seen as either frigid moralizers or fiends. Women in the Victorian age were seen as less free than men, who were seen as always horny and controlled by their biology. In Victorian society, there were two main types of women, the pure and emotionally cold lady and the insatiable deviant. Women had to stay on the path of chastity because if they veered from it, they would always be dirty. If you danced after doing the deed, you wouldn't get pregnant. In the 1800s, French physiologist Eugene Beclard wrote a book called Beclard's Physiology. In it, he gave people some good tips. One of his many claims was that he could stop a woman from getting pregnant by making her dance around the room right after it, or by having her ride a horse the next day. Beclard said a lot of crazy things that don't make sense now, like that you can't get pregnant from rape, and that a couple's personalities determine whether or not they can physically have children. Police were allowed to arrest prostitutes for having STDs. Even though most people in society didn't like prostitutes, that didn't stop people from hiring them. Prostitution without protection led to a rise in sexually transmitted infections, especially in the military. So, in 1864, the Contagious Diseases Acts were passed. These laws let the cops hold women they thought were prostitutes. While the women were in jail, they were checked to see if they had a sexually transmitted infection, STI. If they did, they were sent to a lock hospital for up to 9 months, so they wouldn't give any diseases to men. As was common in Victorian times, these laws were made to protect men, not women. Men got a free pass to mess around, for the most part. By the end of the 19th century, most people thought that men were biologically made to be sexually overactive, so they weren't to blame for sleeping with a lot of women. People who didn't agree with this idea, who were mostly women, started a social purity movement to fix the double standard that helped men. But instead of trying to give women the same freedoms as men, the effort was against all kinds of sexual activity. The people in this group were called New Puritans. Homosexuality was illegal. In the later years of the Victorian era, people were more open about being gay, which was looked upon in the earlier decades. For a while, there wasn't any specific rule against the practice other than laws against public indecency, which were easy to get around. But in 1885, even having gay relationships in secret was made a crime. Oscar Wilde was put in jail 11 years after this law was passed. If both parties didn't climax at the same time, it sucked. When people in the Victorian age did get down, they had to follow a lot of rules. One of these rules says that a relationship is a failure unless both people reach their peak at the same time. In fact, women had every right to refuse to do it if they and their husbands couldn't get the orgasm of the woman and the ejaculation of the semen of the man at the same instant. This idea stuck around into the 20th century. It was written about in books like The Hygiene of Marriage, which came out in 1923. Educating your kids about their parts was encouraged. Professionals told parents in the Victorian era that they should teach their kids about birds and bees and how their different parts work. Part of the reason this was done was so that girls wouldn't be too scared when they got their first period. But only boys were given a lot of information about how it worked and where things went. This meant that some young women had their first sexual experience on their wedding night. Parents were also told to get their kids as much exercise as they could during the day so that they would be too tired to touch themselves in bed. We hope you liked this video. Subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, And please let us know about civilization or time period we should talk about. Also watch another video here.